Gather round, children, gather round. It's story time with Jess, the little writer. In case you didn't know, that's me. Victims, varied and verified. Kenny took a deep breath before opening the door. He didn't know exactly where to go or what to say, but he had already vowed to himself to tell the truth. The police station wasn't as busy as he expected it to be. There were several pairs of officers just standing about, talking and smiling as if there were no bad guys to apprehend. Kenny approached a lone cop sitting at a desk. She was on the phone and looked incredibly bored. Rather than interrupt, Kenny stood back and waited for her conversation to end. The lady cop put the receiver down and invited Kenny to take a seat. "I'm Williams," she said. "Coming to file a report?" Kenny took a folded wad of newspaper clippings out of his back pocket before sitting down. "Hello, Officer Williams," he said, trying to hide how hopelessly nervous he was. Kenny unfolded each clipping and arranged them in rows on the desk. Williams looked amused at first until she realized they were all post-mortem sketches of dead women. Dead women with missing heads. "These women here," Kenny said, "I know who they are. If you could please write down their names." Williams already had a notepad and pen ready. "Let's do left to right," she said, "from the top row down." Kenny put one finger on each image and said a name. In all, there were 27 newly named victims. When the last name was written, Williams stood up with notepad in hand. "I'll be right back," she said. "Don't leave." Kenny felt so much better. It was such a relief to be rid of this burden. For going on 4 months, he'd kept quiet every time a newly mangled corpse was discovered. They were listed as Jane Does, but Kenny knew they deserved more respect than that. Williams returned with 2 detectives in tow. Kenny held his hand out for them to shake. He was so honored that these important individuals wanted to meet him. Detectives Shaw and Bradley invited Kenny to an interrogation room to have privacy. Bradley locked the door and took a seat across the table from Kenny. Shaw remained standing, with a puzzling expression on his face. Bradley opened a photo on the table. Kenny anticipated being prepped for a speech to give the press. After all, he is the one who helped them get a little closer to nabbing a deranged serial killer. They knew the culprit was one person. The execution style was the same. Bradley showed Kenny 4 autopsy photos. They showed the same mark burned into the flesh of the dead. Each one resembled a snake that had formed itself into a triangle with a bird footprint in the center. "What does this mean?" Bradley said. "Gang-related?" Kenny stopped smiling. How would he know? He's not the one who put it there, and he told them so. "So you just happen to know who all these women are?" Bradley said. "But expect us to believe you didn't do this?" To say that Kenny was devastated would be a gross understatement. His heart was broken and his soul crushed. Shaw was more empathetic. He patted Kenny's shoulder and said, "Tell us where you know them from." Kenny perked up again. "From Foreman Kelsey." Shaw raised both eyebrows. "That's a women's college," he said. "There's no way you were ever enrolled there." Kenny straightened his posture and said, "My mom was. When I was little, I lived there with her." Bradley and Shaw glanced at each other. Kenny couldn't tell if they were incredulous or impressed. Reading facial expressions was always a struggle for him. "Okay," Shaw said. "Was there anyone at FK that disliked the staff or students? Any creeps that maybe had a crush on somebody that wasn't reciprocated?" Kenny said, "No, but Corvus did stare a lot." Bradley was getting impatient. He clasped his hands together as if in prayer and closed his eyes. "Who's this Corvus?" Shaw said. "Did he work there?" Kenny nodded. "Yep. Handyman. Could fix anything. Once when I was 7 or 8, he said..." "Said what?" Bradley inquired. Kenny frowned. He couldn't remember. His brain had put this obscure memory at the front of his recall and snatched it back. "I don't remember," Kenny said. "We were playing a game. I closed my eyes and he wrote something on both my arms in invisible ink. After that, I could remember all the ladies at Foreman Kelsey. I still remember them all, and I always know where they are, too." Shaw tapped Bradley on the shoulder. They stepped out into the hall. 40 minutes later, Shaw returned alone, with a small toolbox in hand. Shaw dropped the toolbox on the table. He opened it to reveal some disturbing contents. There were syringes in several different sizes, a blood pressure cuff, a scalpel, and a book that resembled a pocket-sized thesaurus. What's all that for? Kenny said. Are you a doctor too? Shaw shook his head while flipping through his book. He found what he was looking for and spoke some incantation in a language unknown to Kenny. The temperature in the room fell to freezing. Kenny shivered and rocked himself. Hold your arm out, Shaw said. Kenny complied. Shaw applied the cuff to Kenny's right arm and tightened it to the point that Kenny had to grit his teeth. Shaw spoke another spell and Kenny couldn't move. He was physically incapable of rising from his chair, though he tried. Shaw twirled the scalpel around his fingers. He put the blade to Kenny's cuffed arm and began carving. The room was so cold and his arm so numb that he could barely feel it. It felt like an icicle being dragged forcefully across his skin. When the work was done, Shaw moved the cuff to the other arm. The sensation was the same. Shaw tossed the bloody scalpel back into his toolbox. A syringe was next. He injected something unlabeled into Kenny's neck. Kenny could feel himself rising, floating. He hadn't moved from the chair but felt so light, like a feather in a warm breeze. It took Kenny a minute to realize that he was no longer in the interrogation room. He had been transported to a broom closet. Before him stood the man Corvus. Speak his words, Shaw said. Kenny parted his lips. His mouth became a speaker. The words and voice that came out were not his own. It was Corvus performing a spell of some kind. Once the last word was spoken, Kenny screamed. His arms were on fire. Warmth had returned, and he was back to his senses in the present. Kenny tried to hold both his carved-up arms, but they were too painful to touch. He threw himself to the floor, writhing and crying. Shaw selected a new syringe. Kenny felt a stab to the torso, then nothing. The pain subsided, but he now saw clear images, memories of things that he had never done. Or did he? Kenny saw himself strangling Audra Henderson with a rope after breaking her arms and legs. Once she stopped moving, he sawed her head off. He saw himself drawing the triangle serpent and Ravenfoot into her back with a wood-burning pin. The agony of watching himself do these horrible things was much worse than the pain in his arms. Kenny had killed those women, all 27 of them. That dust played in his mind like a slideshow, starting with the most recent. Shaw waited for Kenny to sit up and show some sign of understanding. Kenny sat in a corner of the room with tears streaming down his face. Warlocks are tricky sometimes, Shaw said. We'll deal with this. You can go home. Kenny didn't move. Warlock? Corvus was a warlock? He tricked him into committing murder? Kenny stared at Shaw with bloodshot eyes. Was he a tricky warlock too? I am, Shaw said. Go home. Get your newspaper collection from Williams.